And now to the session titled The Political Power of Art. Actually, the first to recognize the political power of art was the Torah, the Israeli Torah, that was given to us in Mount Sinai. The Israelis were given the Ten Commandments in Mount Sinai. The second commandment says, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," or in Hebrew, "Lo ta'aseh lecha pesel v'kol tmuna." This is the first recognition of the power of art to affect opinions, and this is the second out of 10, the second commandment, which is quite a powerful statement about the power of art. Later, Plato in the 4th century BC wrote a lot about art, and in his book, The Republic, and I will read it slowly, Plato said, "The poet aims at being popular, is not by nature made, nor his art intended to please or to affect rational principle in the soul. The painter, he is like him, the poet, in two ways. First, inasmuch as his creation have an inferior degree of truth, and being concerned with an inferior part of the soul. And therefore," said Plato, "we shall be right in refusing to admit him, the artist, into a well-ordered state, because he impairs the reason. He is a manufacturer of images and is very far from the truth." We have here distinguished artists that I would like later to refer to it. And in summary, to summarize, art, according to Plato, doesn't reflect my opinion. According to Plato, art tries to reflect thoughts and opinions by using manipulation, inferior degree of truth, and being concerned with the inferior part of the soul. And my question is it? To conclude my remarks, of course, we have ISIS who understood very well the power of art, and I think these pictures need no explanation. One of the first acts of ISIS around the world, around the areas they conquered, was to destroy art, because they appreciated what art can do to the minds of people. To summarize, it's very, very hard to conceptualize the true power of art, the true political power of art. It's very hard. I will not even try to attempt to do that. And I hope that our distinguished panelists, which I will introduce each panelist when there's time to talk, will refer to this. Do they agree or disagree with Plato? And most important, what I would like them to address the question, what Israel can do in terms of the use of the power of art to help Israel. And I think Thomas Krens, I will introduce now, will refer to this. Mr. Thomas Krens, our keynote speaker, who came specially to Israel for our session. He served as 25 years as director and chief artistic of the Solomon Guggenheim Foundation, New York. He was responsible for establishing the Guggenheim museums in Bilbao, Berlin, Las Vegas, and now in Abu Dhabi. The vision was that cultural identity and discourse could contribute significantly to long-term stability in regions defined by sharp cultural sensitivities. The museums were to provide an open platform for cultural debate and a window and engagement with to the larger outside world. To quote Mr. Krens, well, I will not quote, you will say it yourself, so I will save this part. Mr. Krens will honor us in talking about the art and security in the global environment. Because of the short delay, we had a chance to talk among ourselves, and he had a very, very interesting observations from creating museums in troublesome areas like Bilbao and Abu Dhabi. So Mr. Krens, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
No, thank you very much and Jerry, for this kind invitation to come to Israel to speak with you. I have to say right at the beginning that while technically this is not my first trip to Israel, it would be the first time that I've stayed here overnight. I've come here twice before for meetings and only know the airport the road from the airport to Tel Aviv, but I'll be here for a few days, and I'm looking forward very much to seeing some aspects of this beautiful country. As Noam said, I'm going to talk about art and security in a global environment, and I added the words an environment of cultural conflict, accelerating technology and change, because these are the kinds of things that are around us, and you all know that means I won't spend any more time talking about that, but I do think it would be useful for me to give you a little fuller description of my background. I mean, I'm not sure, I recognize that this is not an art audience per se, and that your focus could be more on politics and national issues as they affect Israel. And I'll do this very quickly. First of all, besides the Guggenheim, I've been involved in developing museums around the world, and as of now, it's something over 50 museums that I've worked with architects to design. We're usually representing the clients to design the museums, the buildings, the program, and the art that goes in them. It didn't always start out that way. For my first 17 professional years, I was a professor at a small college in northwestern Massachusetts called Williams College. And as it happened during 8 summers in the 1970s, I spent my summers in the Aegean, mainly in Greece and Turkey, and I worked for 4 years on an archaeological excavation at Knidos on the southwest coast of Turkey. And so I absorbed or assimilated something of the local culture. As you can see, I ride a motorcycle, and I used to go back and forth to southern Turkey from Germany on my BMW. And along the way, I discovered the architecture of Sinan, who I began to believe and still believe was the greatest architect in the world. He was in the 15th century the chief architect to Suleiman the Magnificent, and covered, according to Frank Lloyd Wright, more space than any other architect in history, and did so with such an effortless poetry that to talk about Sinan would require the better part of several weeks. But that influence lingered, and while I was at Williams College, it occurred to me that space mattered with respect to art in museums, and that its impact mattered, its social impact and its political impact mattered. And there was a small town right next to Williamstown where the college was called North Adams that had been suffering declining population, had a very high unemployment rate, and 30% of the people living below the poverty line. So I had an insight in 1985 that I could take this factory building, which had just been shut down, not abandoned, but shut down, putting 5,000 people out of work and creating a local crisis. This factory building, or factory complex of 28 buildings, over 1 million square feet, and build it into a museum of contemporary art called MASMOCA. I essentially made the deal with Michael Dukakis, who was governor of Massachusetts at the time, also the presidential candidate that year. He lost to George W. Bush. This would be a different world if that didn't happen, I think. It took a long time for MASMOCA to get off the ground, but I learned many things about art museums and how to develop art museums and the type of experience that people would have when they went to visit, and the uses and impact that these types of institutions can have. In 1988, I went to the Guggenheim, a very well-known museum on Upper Fifth Avenue in New York, and the very first thing to do at the Guggenheim was to build an addition, which you see here, which opened in 1992. So in that process of developing the Guggenheim through its first years, I had to develop a strategic plan for the institution, and that strategic plan was to essentially leverage the brand, to leverage the general awareness of the Guggenheim, the quality of its collections, its location in New York, and not to make one Guggenheim museum, but to make a network of Guggenheim museums. By the time I left, almost 25 years later, the Guggenheim had been established in Venice, in Bilbao, in Berlin, and yes, believe it or not, in Las Vegas, where my partner was Sheldon Adelson, and soon to be, we hope, in Abu Dhabi. But building the buildings was only part of the story, I began to see. I am a populist. I was not a museum person or even an art historian by training, although I ended up teaching art history for almost 17 years. I looked at things in a slightly different way. At the time I was at the Guggenheim, I did 292 exhibitions at our various museums. But the one I'm infamous for is Art of the Motorcycle, followed only by Giorgio Armani. We did motorcycles in Armani as you would do a Picasso retrospective. While they boosted the audience by themselves, they helped to create a general awareness of how broad culture could be. And even though the Guggenheim collection had been focused on late 19th century and early 20th century modern and abstract art, and although we stayed with that theme for about 70% of the exhibitions, we also moved into things like contemporary architecture and big global surveys. I mean, this exhibition is called Brazil, Body and Soul. The centerpiece is that I borrowed an altarpiece from a church in northwestern Brazil, a small town called Olinda, and we brought that altarpiece and installed it. It was 75 feet high, 2,000 pieces. The sculptures on it were larger than life. Imagine negotiating with the chief abbot at the monastery to tell him that you want to take his only religious relic out of the church for 2 years, for which you would pay him $2 million and cure the termites in the church. That was the punchline. Anyway, we did that at the Guggenheim. We found that the Guggenheim became an international institution. We became involved in all parts of the world, in China, in Russia. And even Kofi Annan wanted me to do a museum in Africa that we never got around to doing. And we never gave up our commitment to contemporary art, and always transforming the space, and always making an intellectual spectacle, never talking down to the audience, but talking up to the audience for the work that we did. And what motivated all of this was audience. Audience is everything. When I came to the Guggenheim, we had about 300,000 visitors a year. In New York, when I left the Guggenheim, we were enjoying over 1 million visitors a year, which is about the capacity of the building. You really can't get any more in it. And it sustained those levels of attendance for a long time. In short, the Guggenheim has become a global brand. My main purpose here today is to use 2 projects that we did, one in Bilbao and one in Abu Dhabi, as examples of how the topic of art and security can be approached on the broadest possible levels. First of all, I'm going to underline this, is that these projects are expensive. They're not easy to do from a political standpoint, from a financial standpoint. And you always have to ask the question of your partners, why? What is their motivation? You know, we were clearly interested in the strategy of international expansion when Bilbao was proposed to me in 1991. And I originally was not interested. I had no idea where Bilbao was, and I quite frankly and directly told the president of the Basque Country that the images that conjure up to me with the word Bilbao are terrorism and highlight. Terrorism because in the previous 20 years, from the late 1960s through the late 1980s, there had been more than 800 political assassinations in the Basque Country. It was regarded as a dangerous place. My Spanish friends used to tell me to stay away from the Basque Country because they're baby killers. Not exactly the place you want to take a cautious New York-based board of directors. However, we went to Bilbao because when I outlined the scope of the project, the scale of it, how much it would cost for the building, how much it would cost to endow a program, how much it would cost to build a collection, the president of the Basque Country, literally at the very first meeting, he put his hand across the table and he said, "You've got a deal." That didn't happen to me very often, that the guy in charge says you got a deal when you tell him the price tag is $400 million. And this was in 1991. Why did they do it? I mean, they did it for political reasons, obviously. A Guggenheim in Bilbao of this scale would make the Basque Country relevant, and it would give them some critical weight in their cultural contest with the central government, the Spanish central government. The Basque Country is a province, one of 17 provinces, but it has been lobbying for and fighting for its independence as a sovereign state for most of the 20th century. And to the degree that the political leaders recognized that that was not a possibility, they were interested in the next best thing, which was to levering the scale of their autonomy while remaining within the boundaries of the Spanish state. And having a world-class relevant institution would support that argument. They were interested in recognition independent of Spain, and the Frank Gehry building, the Guggenheim's presence, would tend to that. They were also interested in identity, as I soon learned. The identity as a world-class institution, as a Basque institution, and getting onto that theme very early, we suggested that there be three languages upon which the museum would be based: Basque, Spanish, and English in that order, and that all the signage would be in Basque, and that a third of the programming and a third of the acquisitions would be Basque and Spanish artists. So the nuance here was not that you were setting up a platform simply for Basque culture or for Spanish culture or for Basque and Spanish culture, but you were nesting them in the context of world-class contemporary and historical art. And there's a certain pride that attends to that. You find that your opponents have pause when they realize that you'll be doing an exhibition of Picasso one day and then George Oteiza, the local Basque hero, the next day. And then we even imported Spanish artists. I did 3 retrospectives of Spanish artists, or Basque artists, sorry, at the Guggenheim in New York. And of course, the social impact, the museum changed the society. The economic development was enormous. I mean, it had no tourist visitation, and the museum, when it opened in 1997, had 1.4 million visitors. And up until that point, the highest predictions of the press were for 250,000. Security was an issue. Up until the time I went to the Basque Country, it was a country in turmoil and conflict. When I first started going there, I would go in armored cars, and I'd have armed guards outside my hotel doors. And indeed, before the museum opened, there was an attack. Terrorists tried to smuggle rocket launchers into the museum. There was a gunfight. The guards were armed in those days, and the museum guard was killed. Since the museum opened, and I'm not necessarily drawing a one-to-one comparison, is that physical terrorism, armed terrorism, deadly terrorism has all but disappeared in the Basque Country. Now, I'm not saying that's because of the museum. I mean, I think that's a simple-minded conclusion. And maybe these forces were also already underway, but the fact of the matter is that this cultural institution was probably the best investment that the Basque ever made, because it did capture and channel some of these forces. It did give an outlet and platform to various points of view. And I think that that's a relative success story. In today's dollars, the Guggenheim in Bilbao cost about $600 million. The deal was made fairly quickly. The museum was monumental. And it even had spaces like this one, which was 456 feet long. Those sculptures by Richard Serra weigh 1,200 tons. It's not a common space. You actually have to design a museum with the capacity to support 1,200 tons. This was the Jeff Koons puppy dog in front of the museum in Bilbao. Its installation was the occasion of the smuggling of the rocket launchers into the museum site. The economic impact, it cost the Basque government about $243 million between 1992 and 1997. Another 100 million for acquisitions. It's produced over 16 million visitors as of 2011. I didn't have time to update these numbers. Averaging over 1 million visitors a year. Enormous impact to the local economy. Created 5,000 jobs and generated tax revenues that more than paid for the building. A little side payment to show you, or a side story to show you that things don't go always as well as you would like. My next project was to take on New York City. There was a competition for a piece of land off Wall Street. Donald Trump was one of the competitors. Frank Gehry we selected as an architect. The chairman of my board committed $250 million. Bob Rauschenberg committed his entire collection. We won the competition under the Giuliani administration. Got a $68 million additional grant from the state. This was November of 2000. A year later, this was over. The plans were permanently, of building something of that scale in lower Manhattan off Wall Street were no longer a possibility. So I had to rethink what I was going to do at that time. And I was attracted to what was going on in Qatar, mainly by a tall, elegant woman in the red dress, Sheikha Mossa, who was moving vast amounts of resources of the Al Thani family into health, education, and culture. I became friends with Sheikh Saud, who was the de facto culture minister. We had numerous meetings in Doha, and we were hired to develop a cultural master plan for Qatar in 2003. We worked on it diligently for 2 years, and then one day Sheikh Saud was fired, put under house arrest. Government canceled all the projects. I never went back to Doha. However, next door, the story had continued. 5 minutes, okay, I'll go very fast. Jacques Chirac was talking with Sheikh Zayed to develop Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi. Saadiyat Island cultural district alone is about half the size of Manhattan. We were hired to do the architectural master plan. So I did it on motorcycles and in tents. Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Zaha Hadid, Tadao Ando, and Norman Foster were hired as architects. I spent weeks and months with all of the architects in various cities around the world designing the initial buildings. A big presentation took place on the 27th of January in 2007. The exhibition opened. We signed the agreement for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi 6 months later. And this is the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. A good deal bigger than Bilbao. 81,000 square meters. Its initial budget was $815 million with a $600 million acquisitions budget. To give you a sense of scale, that little mass at the bottom right is the Guggenheim in New York. Right above it is Guggenheim in Bilbao, and that's the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi was pharaonic in scale. I call it the apotheosis. It was an opportunity to bring the entire world under this plan, this map of the Guggenheim, including a center for Middle Eastern culture that tried to empower curators from all over the region independently on a platform of exhibition space totally devoted to the art of the Middle East. The Louvre, designed by Jean Nouvel, I think is going to be one of the most exciting buildings in the world. It's about to open. They're going to have a lighting ceremony at the end of this year. I won't describe it, other to say that politics are still behind it. Here's the French foreign minister visiting last week. Extraordinary building. The Guggenheim is delayed, maybe 2020, but the Guggenheim has inspired an artistic participation. These images from a couple of weeks ago, the issue was the Gulf labor conditions. The Gulf Labor Coalition did this fabulous video performance on the outside of the Guggenheim, much to the consternation of the Guggenheim and its trustees. They even did it on the sides of the buildings where the trustees lived. So dialogue is working. In other words, I saw this. I know the board probably doesn't see it the same way, but I saw this as that it's already moving in the right direction. To sum up, the implicit question, do the examples of Bilbao, Abu Dhabi, flawed as they may be, have any strategic long-term security implications for the larger Middle East? You know, the same issues are in play, and even for Abu Dhabi now more so. But perhaps, if they have any impact at all, the question here may not simply be one of fortress versus dominance with specific reference to Israel and its neighbors. It's hard to imagine a long-term solution that does not have hard security apparatus at its core. At the same time, it's equally hard to imagine a coexistence that does not have some economic development and a dignified standard of living for all of those who live in the region. And whether art and culture or museum complex or cultural complexes can play a role in forging a better balance, it is a simultaneous exercise in the pursuit of both a hard and soft power strategy. Whether that balance can be achieved remains to be seen. You know, it will, I can tell you, depend on the will and the imagination of the leadership. I mean, in any project that went forward that I've been involved in, it always had a local champion who was willing to take risks. Without that local champion, it couldn't happen. So, I will stop there. I realize I'm looking at my please finish sign for the last 10 minutes.